The great chamber of the Galactic Linguistic Council stretched before Dr. Elena Vasquez like a vast amphitheater of minds. Above her, the curved ceiling displayed the slowly rotating logos of 100 different worlds, each symbol representing a species that had joined the galactic community. The air hummed with the quiet efficiency of universal translators, devices that had made this gathering possible. Elena sat in the human section, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she watched the proceedings. Around her, beings of every imaginable shape and size filled the tiered seating. To her left, the crystalline Zephyrians chimed softly as they communicated through harmonic frequencies. To her right, the tall, mantis-like Keplerians clicked their mandibles in what she had learned was their equivalent of polite attention. The day's discussion centered on a discovery that had excited linguists across the galaxy. 3 months ago, an archaeological team had uncovered extensive ruins on a dead world in the outer spiral. Among the artifacts were thousands of stone tablets covered in an unknown script. The language had been dubbed Zerathi, after the world where it was found, and it had become the subject of intense academic interest. Dr. Klix, the lead Zentorian linguist, stood at the central podium. His blue-scaled skin gleamed under the chamber's lights as he gestured toward the massive holographic display behind him. Complex symbols floated in the air, rotating slowly so that every delegate could examine them from their preferred angle. "Respected colleagues," Klix began, his voice carrying easily through the translation system. "After months of careful analysis, we have reached several important conclusions about the Zerathi language." He paused, allowing the translators to catch up with the various species that required longer processing times. Elena leaned forward slightly. She had been following the research with great interest, though she had not yet contributed to the discussion. As one of humanity's representatives to the Council, she was here primarily to observe and learn. Humans were still relatively new to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 years ago. Our analysis indicates that Zerathi was a highly sophisticated language. Collix continued. The grammar structure suggests a species with advanced mathematical and philosophical thinking. The vocabulary includes terms for concepts that some of our own languages lack. Murmurs of appreciation rippled through the chamber. Dr. Morthak, a representative from the silicon-based crystalline collective, rose from her seat. Her voice resonated with the deep musical tones characteristic of her species. "Dr. Collix, have you been able to determine when this language was last spoken?" Collix's scales shifted to a deeper blue, a sign Elena recognized as indicating certainty among Zentorians. "Based on our dating of the artifacts and the linguistic analysis, we estimate that Zerathi has been extinct for approximately 50,000 years. The geological evidence from the planet supports this timeline. Whatever catastrophe befell the Zerathi civilization, it was complete and final. Most importantly," Collix added with emphasis, "we can state with complete confidence that there are no living speakers of this language anywhere in the known galaxy. Zerathi is, in every sense of the word, a dead language. It exists now only in these stone tablets, a fascinating window into a lost civilization." Nods and sounds of agreement came from around the chamber. Dr. Viridian from the Aquatic Federation added, "This makes the translation work all the more valuable. We are literally the first beings in 50 millennia to attempt to understand these thoughts." Elena found herself taking detailed notes, though not for the reasons the other delegates might have expected. Her handwriting was quick and precise, filling page after page of her notebook. Occasionally, she would pause to consider a particular phrase or symbol on the display, her expression thoughtful. The discussion continued for another hour. Various experts presented their theories about Zerathi grammar, vocabulary, and cultural context. The consensus was clear. This was a remarkable archaeological find, but purely historical in nature. The language was as dead as the world where it had been discovered. As the session neared its end, Dr. Collix called for any final questions or comments. Several delegates rose to praise the research team's work and discuss potential follow-up studies. Elena remained in her seat, continuing to write in her notebook. "Dr. Vasquez," Collix said, his attention turning to the human section. "We have not heard from Earth's representative today. Do you have any observations about our research?" Elena looked up from her notes, meeting the Zentorian's gaze across the chamber. For a moment she said nothing. Then slowly a small smile spread across her face. It was a quiet smile, the kind that suggested someone was keeping a secret. "Your research is very thorough, Dr. Collix," she said finally. Her voice was calm and measured, carrying easily through the translation system. "The analysis of the grammar and vocabulary is particularly impressive. I found your conclusions about the extinction timeline quite interesting." Something in her tone made several delegates turn to look at her more closely. Dr. Clix's scales shifted to a lighter shade of blue, indicating curiosity. "Do you have any specific comments about our methodology or findings?" Elena closed her notebook and placed it carefully on the table in front of her. She looked around the chamber, taking in the faces and expressions of beings from dozens of worlds. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of gentle amusement. "Not at this time," she said simply. "I think I'll wait to see how the research develops." She paused, her smile becoming slightly more pronounced. After all, languages can be full of surprises. With that, Elena gathered her materials and prepared to leave with the other delegates as the session concluded. But those who were watching carefully might have noticed that her notebook was filled, not just with observations about the presentation, but with line after line of familiar-looking symbols. Symbols that matched perfectly with those displayed on Dr. Collix's holographic presentation. As the great chamber began to empty, Elena walked quietly toward the exit, her secret safe for now. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, but tonight, she would return to her quarters and remember. Remember a world that wasn't as dead as everyone believed, and a people whose language lived on in the mind of one determined human woman. The next morning brought an atmosphere of excitement to the Galactic Linguistic Council. Word had spread that Dr. Clix had made a significant breakthrough in translating the Zerathi texts overnight. Elena arrived early to the chamber, taking her usual seat in the human section. She carried the same notebook as before, along with a small recording device. The chamber filled quickly as delegates eager to hear the new developments took their places. Dr. Collix stood at the podium with obvious pride, his blue scales practically glowing with satisfaction. Behind him, the holographic display showed a complex passage of Zerathi text, alongside what appeared to be a complete translation. "Esteemed colleagues," Collix began, his voice carrying a note of triumph, "I am pleased to announce that our translation AI has successfully decoded one of the most complex Zerathi texts discovered to date. This passage appears to be a scientific treatise dealing with advanced quantum mechanics and dimensional theory." Excited murmurs filled the chamber. Elena listened carefully, her pen moving across her notebook as she took detailed notes. Her expression remained neutral, but her writing was quick and precise. "The translation process required our most advanced computational systems working continuously for 48 hours, Collix continued. "The complexity of the Zerathi mathematical concepts pushed our AI to its limits. However, I am confident that we have achieved an accurate translation." He gestured toward the display, where the translated text appeared in standard galactic script. "As you can see, the Zerathi had developed theories about quantum entanglement that are remarkably sophisticated. In fact, some of their concepts are more advanced than our current understanding. This passage discusses the manipulation of quantum fields in ways that our physicists are only beginning to explore." Dr. Morthak from the Crystalline Collective spoke up. "Dr. Clix, this is remarkable work. To think that a civilization from 50,000 years ago had such advanced knowledge. Have you verified the translation with independent systems?" "Of course," Collix replied. 3 separate AI systems have confirmed the accuracy of the translation. The grammar analysis matches our established understanding of Zerathi linguistic patterns. I am prepared to stake my reputation on the correctness of this work." The delegates around the chamber nodded appreciatively. This was exactly the kind of breakthrough that made xenoarchaeology so exciting. Elena, however, had stopped taking notes. Instead, she was studying the translation on the display with increasing attention. After several minutes of enthusiastic discussion among the delegates, Elena raised her hand. The gesture was simple and polite, but something about it caused the chamber to gradually fall silent. All eyes turned to the human representative. "Dr. Clix," Elena said, her voice clear and steady, "I wonder if I might offer a small observation about your translation." Clix's scales shifted to a slightly more defensive shade of blue. "Certainly, Dr. Vasquez, though I should mention that the translation has been thoroughly verified by our most advanced systems." Elena stood and moved closer to the podium, her notebook in hand. "I'm sure it has," However, I notice a small error in the third paragraph. The word you've translated as entanglement should actually be resonance. In Zerathi, the symbol for quantum entanglement has an additional mark that indicates causality, which is absent here. The chamber went completely silent. Dr. Culloch stared at her, his scales rapidly cycling through several shades of blue. I'm sorry, Dr. Vasquez, but I'm not sure I understand. Are you saying you can read Zerathi? Elena smiled that same quiet smile from the day before. I'm saying your translation has some inaccuracies. For instance, in the 5th paragraph, you've rendered the phrase about dimensional barriers as a statement of fact, but the grammatical structure indicates it's actually a question. The Zerathi author is asking whether dimensional barriers can be overcome, not claiming they can be. She paused, looking directly at the holographic display. And in the final paragraph, there's a beautiful metaphor that your AI missed entirely. The author compares the universe to a vast song, with each dimension representing a different harmony. It's quite poetic, actually. Dr. Viridian from the Aquatic Federation was the first to find her voice. Dr. Vasquez, with all due respect, how could you possibly know these details about a language that has been extinct for 50,000 years? Instead of answering directly, Elena opened her notebook and began to read aloud. But the sounds that came from her mouth were not in any language the universal translators could process. The melodic flowing syllables of Zerathi filled the chamber, each word pronounced with perfect clarity and confidence. As she spoke, the delegates watched in stunned amazement. The sounds matched the rhythm and flow that their linguistic analysis had suggested Zerathi should have. But more than that, Elena spoke with the fluency of a native speaker, her intonation natural and effortless. When she finished reading the passage, Elena closed her notebook and looked around the chamber. That was the original text as it was meant to be spoken. The author's name was Kethmiran, and this was part of her doctoral thesis on quantum harmonics. She was quite young when she wrote it, actually. Only about 60 years old. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Every being present stared at Elena with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief. Dr. Culloch's scales had turned a pale, almost white shade of blue that indicated complete confusion. Dr. Vasquez? Click said slowly. What you just did should be impossible. No one has spoken Zerathi for 50,000 years. How can you possibly read and pronounce a dead language with such fluency? Elena looked around the chamber one more time, taking in the shocked faces of the galaxy's most accomplished linguists. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Because, Dr. Culloch, she said quietly, Zerathi isn't as dead as you think it is. The emergency session of the Galactic Linguistic Council convened within hours of Elena's shocking revelation. Every major representative was present, along with several additional experts who had been called in specifically for this unprecedented situation. The chamber buzzed with nervous energy as beings from across the galaxy tried to process what they had witnessed. Elena sat calmly at the center of attention, her hands folded in her lap. Around her, delegates whispered in dozens of languages, their universal translators working overtime to keep up with the rapid conversations. Dr. Culloch stood at the podium, his scales still showing the pale blue of confusion and concern. Dr. Vasquez, began Council Chairman Zerion, a tall, elegant being from the Ethereal Collective. Your claims this morning have created quite a stir throughout the academic community. We must ask you to explain how you came to possess knowledge of a language that our best experts have determined to be extinct for 50,000 years. Elena looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of beings from dozens of worlds. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady. It's a long story, Chairman Zerion, and I'm afraid it's going to challenge some of your assumptions about the galaxy we think we know. She stood and moved to the center of the chamber. 52 years ago, I was a 25-year-old xenoarchaeologist on humanity's first deep space expedition. We were young, excited, and perhaps a bit reckless. Our ship, the Endeavor, was pushing further into uncharted space than any human vessel had gone before. Elena paused, her mind clearly traveling back across the decades. We were mapping star systems in what you now call the outer spiral. Our navigation computers were primitive by today's standards, and we were using experimental jump drives that were still being tested. On our 43rd day out, something went wrong. The jump drive malfunctioned during a routine hyperspace transit. Instead of emerging at our planned coordinates, we found ourselves in an unknown system. Our engines were damaged, our navigation systems were offline, and we were stranded on the edge of space with no way to call for help. Dr. Morthak leaned forward in her seat. Dr. Vasquez, what does this have to do with the Zarathi language? Elena smiled. Patience, Dr. Morthak. We managed to reach the third planet in the system before our ship finally gave out completely. It was a remarkable world, actually. The gravity was perfect for humans, the atmosphere was breathable, and there were clear signs of ancient civilization. We thought we had stumbled onto an archaeological treasure. Our chief engineer estimated that repairs would take several months. We had enough supplies to last, so we set up a temporary base near our landing site and began exploring. That's when I made the discovery that would change my life forever. Elena's voice took on a note of wonder, as if she were still amazed by what she had found. 3 days into our exploration, I detected strange energy readings coming from beneath the surface. When we investigated, we found hidden entrances leading to vast underground cities. And these cities weren't empty. The chamber erupted in surprised murmurs. Chairman Zarian called for order. Are you saying you found living inhabitants on this world? I am indeed, Elena replied. The Zarathi weren't extinct at all. A small population had survived by retreating underground after some great catastrophe had devastated their surface civilization millennia ago. They had been living in hidden cities, maintaining their culture and their language, waiting for the day when their world might be safe again. When my team made contact, the Zarathi were initially frightened. They hadn't seen outsiders for thousands of years. But once they realized we meant no harm, they became incredibly curious about us. I think we were the most interesting thing that had happened to them in a very long time. Elena began to pace slowly as she spoke, her memory clearly carrying her back to that distant world. My colleagues focused on repairing our ship and documenting the surface ruins. But I became fascinated by the living Zarathi culture. I spent every free moment in the underground cities learning their customs, their history, and their language. The Zarathi were amazing teachers. Their language was complex and beautiful, full of concepts and ideas that human languages don't have. They had words for types of time that we can't even imagine, and ways of describing mathematical relationships that made our equations seem clumsy by comparison. Dr. Viridian interrupted. Dr. Vasquez, if this is true, where are these Zarathi now? Why haven't they made contact with the galactic community? Elena's expression grew sad. That's the tragic part of this story, Dr. Viridian. By the time we encountered them, the Zarathi were already a dying people. Not from disease or war, but from something much more subtle and heartbreaking. They had survived physically, you see, but they were losing the will to continue. For thousands of years, they had been living in isolation, watching their numbers slowly dwindle. They had no hope of reclaiming their world's surface, no contact with other civilizations, no purpose beyond simple survival. When I met them, there were perhaps 200 Zarathi left, spread across several underground settlements. They were all elderly by their standards, and none had chosen to have children in decades. They were waiting to die, essentially, waiting for their species to fade away quietly. Elena stopped pacing and looked directly at the assembled delegates. I spent 8 months with them while our ship was being repaired. 8 months learning their language, their customs, their stories, their dreams. And in all that time, I came to understand something important about languages and the beings who speak them. A language isn't just words and grammar. It's a way of thinking, a way of understanding the universe. When the last speaker of a language dies, entire ways of perceiving reality disappear forever. The Zarathi knew this, and it was slowly breaking their hearts. The chamber was completely silent now, every delegate hanging on Elena's words. She continued, her voice carrying the weight of memory and loss. When our ship was finally repaired and it came time to leave, the eldest Zarathi, a being named Thekmar, made a request that has haunted me for over 50 years. He asked me to remember them, not just as archaeological specimens or scientific curiosities, but as people with hopes and dreams and beautiful ways of understanding the world. Elena's voice grew soft. He asked me to carry their language to the stars, so that some part of their civilization would survive even after the last Zarathi had died. I promised him I would. It was the least I could do for people who had shown me such kindness and taught me so much. She looked around the chamber one final time. That's how I learned to speak Zarathi, esteemed colleagues. Not from books or computers or archaeological analysis, but from the last living speakers of one of the galaxy's most beautiful languages. And that's why I can tell you that Dr. Cullix's translation, impressive as it is, misses the poetry and subtlety that made Zarathi truly special. The silence that followed Elena's story was profound. Delegates from across the galaxy sat in stunned contemplation, processing the implications of what they had heard. Dr. Collix's scales had cycled through several shades of blue before settling on a deep, thoughtful hue. Chairman Zarion was the first to speak. Dr. Vasquez, your account is remarkable, but it raises many questions. If you left these Zarathi alive 52 years ago, what happened to them? Our deep space surveys have found no trace of living populations in the outer spiral. Elena's expression grew heavy with sorrow. That's the part of the story I hoped I would never have to tell, Chairman. But since we're here, discussing their language as if it were merely an archaeological curiosity, I suppose the time has come. She moved to the center of the chamber, her voice taking on the cadence of someone sharing a painful memory. When the Endeavor was finally repaired, we faced a difficult decision. The Zarathi world was beautiful and habitable, but it was far from any established space lanes. We had no way to establish regular contact or provide ongoing support. More importantly, the Zarathi themselves were divided about what they wanted. Some hoped that contact with humanity might give them a reason to continue their species. Others felt that they had lived long enough in hiding and preferred to end their story on their own terms. Dr. Morthak's crystalline form chimed softly. What did they decide? Elena closed her eyes for a moment. Thekimar called a great council of all the remaining Zarathi. They debated for days in their beautiful underground chambers, speaking in voices that sounded like music and using words that could express emotions humans don't even have names for. In the end, they made a choice that I think showed incredible wisdom and courage. They decided that their time as a living species was ending, but they didn't want their culture to die with them. That's when Thekmar made his request to me. Elena opened her eyes and looked around the chamber. He asked me to become their living memory, to learn not just their language but their stories, their science, their poetry, their philosophy, everything that made them who they were. He wanted me to carry it all out into the galaxy so that something of the Zarathi would survive. So that's what I did. For my final month on their world, I studied with intensity I had never experienced before or since. The Zarathi taught me everything they could. Their creation myths, their mathematical theories, their architectural principles, their recipes for food I can't even describe. They gave me recordings of their music, samples of their art, copies of their literature. Most importantly, they taught me to think in their language, not just speak it, to understand the universe the way they understood it. Dr. Viridian from the Aquatic Federation spoke quietly. And then you left them. Then I left them, Elena confirmed. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. When the Endeavor lifted off from their world, I watched through the viewport as the landscape fell away below us. I knew I would never see any of them again. The journey back to human space took 6 months. When we finally reached Earth, I immediately began lobbying for a return expedition. I wanted to establish contact, to bring the Zarathi into the galactic community, to find some way to help them continue their species. Elena's voice grew bitter, but the authorities weren't interested. Humanity was still struggling to establish its own place in galactic society. Resources were limited, and a rescue mission to save a handful of aliens on a distant world wasn't considered a priority. I spent 3 years fighting bureaucracy, writing reports, giving presentations, begging anyone who would listen to authorize a return mission. Finally, when I had almost given up hope, the Earth government agreed to send a long-range probe to check on the Zarathi world. The chamber waited in tense silence as Elena gathered herself to continue. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. The probe reached the Zarathi system 5 years after we had left. Its sensors detected no life signs anywhere on the planet. The underground cities were empty. The Zarathi were gone. Later analysis suggested that they had died peacefully, probably within a year of our departure. The probe found evidence that they had sealed their cities carefully, preserving their art and records for anyone who might someday find them. It appeared that they had simply chosen to let go. Elena looked up at the assembled delegates, tears glistening in her eyes. Do you understand what that means? The Zarathi could have lived for decades more, perhaps even centuries with proper medical support. But they were tired. Tired of hiding. Tired of watching their culture slowly fade away. Tired of being the last remnants of something that had once been great. They chose to end their story on their own terms, in their own time, in their own way. But before they did, They made sure that something of who they were would survive. They gave me their language, their knowledge, their memories. They made me the keeper of everything they had been. Dr. Calix's voice was gentle when he spoke. Dr. Vasquez, that's an incredible burden to carry. Why didn't you share this knowledge sooner? Elena wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. Because I wanted to honor their memory properly. For 50 years, I've been working to document everything they taught me. Every word, every concept, every story. I've been waiting for the right moment to share their legacy with the galaxy. When I heard that Zarathi ruins had been discovered, I thought perhaps that moment had finally come. But then I listened to yesterday's presentation, and I realized that you were treating their language like a puzzle to be solved, rather than a gift to be treasured. She looked directly at Dr. Calix. Your translation work is excellent, Dr. Calix, and I don't mean to diminish it. But when you speak of Zarathi as a dead language, you're missing something important. Languages don't die when the last native speaker passes away. They die when the last person who remembers them stops caring about what they meant. Elena's voice grew stronger, more confident. The Zarathi language isn't dead, honored colleagues. It lives in my memory and my understanding and my dreams. And now, if you're willing to listen, it can live in yours as well. The Galactic Linguistic Council chamber had never experienced such a profound silence. Every delegate, from the crystalline collective representatives to the aquatic federation members, sat motionless as Elena's words settled over them like a gentle benediction. Even the universal translator seemed to pause, as if processing not just language but the weight of memory itself. Elena reached into her satchel and withdrew a small, metallic device that gleamed with an otherworldly sheen. 50 years ago, Thekmar gave me this, she said, holding it up for all to see. It's a Zarathi memory crystal, containing the complete cultural archive of their civilization, everything they wanted to preserve for future generations. She activated the device, and suddenly the air above the chamber filled with a three-dimensional display of impossible beauty. Holographic representations of Zarathi art, architecture, and scientific diagrams materialized, rotating slowly in the air. But more than that, the chamber filled with sound. Melodic Zarathi voices speaking, singing, laughing, teaching. This is Kethmiran, Elena said as a graceful, luminescent being appeared in the hologram. The physicist whose work Dr. Calix was translating yesterday. She was brilliant, curious, and had a wonderful sense of humor. She loved to explain complex theories through poetry. The delegates watched in awe as the hologram showed Kethmiran working in what appeared to be a laboratory filled with devices that defied easy description. As she worked, she spoke in flowing Zarathi, her voice like music even to ears that couldn't understand the words. And this is Thekmar, Elena continued as the image shifted to show an elderly Zarathi with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. He was their greatest philosopher and historian. He taught me that knowledge without compassion is just noise, but compassion without knowledge is just sentiment. More images followed. Zarathi children playing games that required mathematical thinking humans had never imagined. Artists creating sculptures that seemed to bend space itself. Engineers designing technologies that made current galactic science look primitive. For 50 years, I've been documenting all of this, Elena said as she gestured to the swirling display above them. Not just the language, but the science, the art, the philosophy, the mathematics. The Zarathi had developed theories about consciousness that could revolutionize psychology. Their understanding of quantum mechanics was centuries ahead of our current knowledge. Dr. Calix stood slowly, his scales shimmering with what Elena had learned to recognize as deep emotion among Centaurians. Dr. Vasquez, this is beyond anything we could have imagined. Why did you wait so long to share this? Elena smiled, but there was sadness in her expression. Because I needed to be sure it would be treated with the respect it deserves. The Zarathi didn't just give me information. They gave me the responsibility of being their voice in a universe that had forgotten them. I couldn't share that lightly. But listening to yesterday's session, hearing their language discussed as if it were just another archaeological puzzle, I realized that the time for waiting was over. The Zarathi deserve to be remembered not as curiosities, but as people, as teachers, as friends. Chairman Zarian spoke, his ethereal voice carrying unprecedented emotion. Dr. Vasquez, on behalf of the Galactic Council, I must ask, would you be willing to share this knowledge with our institutions? To help us learn not just the Zarathi language, but their way of thinking? More than willing, Elena replied. It's what I've been preparing for my entire adult life. I have complete linguistic documentation, scientific treatises that could advance our understanding of physics by decades, artistic works that will inspire creators across the galaxy, and philosophical insights that could change how we think about consciousness itself. She paused and looked around the chamber. But I have one condition. This knowledge can't be treated as just another academic subject. It has to be shared with the understanding that every word, every concept, every idea comes from real people who lived, loved, dreamed, and died hoping that something of themselves would survive. Dr. Morthak's crystalline form chimed with what Elena recognized as agreement. Dr. Vasquez, how do you propose we honor this responsibility? Elena gestured to the still glowing holographic display. We established the Zirathi Cultural Institute, not just a research center but a living memorial. We teach their language not as an academic exercise but as a way of thinking. We study their science not just for practical applications, but to understand how they saw the universe. Most importantly, we remember them as individuals. Every time someone uses a Zirathi concept or studies their mathematics or appreciates their art, they should know that this came from Kethmiran, who loved to laugh while she worked, or Thekmar, who could make the most complex philosophy sound like poetry. The chamber erupted in the closest thing to applause that a multi-species gathering could achieve. Centaurian scales shimmered. Crystalline collective members chimed in harmony. Aquatic Federation representatives produced their musical bubbling sounds, and dozens of other species added their own expressions of approval. As the celebration continued, Elena raised her hand for silence. When the chamber quieted, she spoke in Zirathi, her voice carrying the musical cadences of a language that had once been thought lost forever. The universal translators caught some of the meaning, but the full beauty of the words remained in the original tongue. When she finished, she looked around the chamber with tears in her eyes. That was a blessing Thekmar taught me. It thanks the ancestors for allowing their children to find new homes among the stars. For 50 years I've carried the Zirathi in my heart and my memory. Now I share them with you. The Zirathi believed that death was not the end of a story, but its transformation into something new. They're not gone, honored colleagues. They live now in our understanding and our wonder, in our commitment to remember them not as specimens but as teachers. Dr. Collix approached Elena, his scales now showing the deep blue of profound respect. Dr. Vasquez, I owe you an apology. When I said Zirathi was a dead language, I was wrong. Languages only die when we forget why they mattered to the people who spoke them. Elena smiled and placed a gentle hand on the Centaurian's scaled arm. No apology needed, Dr. Collix. You did excellent work with the materials you had. Now we can do even better work together. As the session concluded and delegates began to file out of the chamber, Elena remained standing by the holographic display. The images of Kethmiran and Thekmar continued to rotate slowly in the air, their faces serene and wise. For the first time in 50 years, Elena felt the weight of her promise truly shared. The Zirathi would live on, not as relics or curiosities, but as part of the living tapestry of galactic knowledge and culture. Humanity had once again done what it did best, preserved what others thought lost and shared what should never be forgotten. As she prepared to leave the chamber, Elena whispered one final phrase in Zirathi, a thank you to old friends who had entrusted her with their greatest treasure. In the shimmering hologram above, Thekmar's image seemed to nod in approval, and Elena knew that her long vigil was finally over. The Zirathi had found their new home among the stars, carried there by the determination of one human woman who had never forgotten a promise made in the depths of an underground city on a distant world.